Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to get started right now because we got two speakers and a lot to fit in 50 minutes. So yeah, we are here on unceded Musqueam lands. I just want to take a second to think about what that means and how we've engaged with Musqueam and the neighboring Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations since being a part of the UBC community. If you have considered decolonial methods in your research, and if you have not, how you might be able to do that in the future. And with that, I'd like to introduce Joe Fitzgibbons. I had the pleasure to work with Joe the last 2.5 years as both a colleague and a mentor to me. It's been great. Joe, before coming here, got a master's in environmental studies and planning from the University of Waterloo, where she got the Governor General's Gold Medal for her research, which is very amazing. Yes, and her research here at UBC, much of it is funded by a SSHRC in honor of Nelson Mandela, very cool award. And Joe has also been working with me and Dana Johnson and Kai Chan on the Public Scholars Initiative work. And I guess today Joe will be speaking about rewilding in the city and all of its other interpretations. Just turn that over to Joe.
Too many finagly things. Okay, here it is. Okay, audio fine. Okay. Hi everyone, good to see you all. I want to take a second before I get started just to give a shout out to my co-authors on this paper. I am not working alone in this. Anna, Dan, Dana, and Kai have all contributed a lot of the great thinking that's gone into this paper as well. So thank you all. Most of you are here. Just to set some expectations, I guess, for what we'll explore today, we're going to talk a little bit about what rewilding might mean, a little bit about why it's a controversial term and what folks are arguing about, and then what I think rewilding as a science and practice can learn from this idea of boundary objects. And first, what is rewilding? And I'll give a super abridged version of this story because it's one that you all probably stay awake at night thinking about anyway. The world is in crisis, the oceans are warming, we're losing irreplaceable species at a very, very fast rate. And before we can understand what rewilding is, we have to first understand something called extinction debt. And extinction debt means that even if we were to stop all deforestation, all overharvesting, overfishing, and become a completely sustainable society starting today, we would actually still continue to see extinctions happening because of the delayed and cascading consequences of the changes we've made to ecosystems and ecological functions. So conservation, if that means preserving the best of what we have, is really important, but it's actually not enough to prevent extinctions from happening. And rewilding as an approach tries to address this by actually refilling the cup. So if the species are the water that's kind of all fallen out on the floor, conservation is a patch to prevent the losses from happening, but rewilding actually seeks to reintroduce and recreate some of those processes and species that have been lost in the landscape. That's pretty much where the agreement about what rewilding means ends in true scholastic fashion. It's enjoying a surge in popularity in the last few years. You can see in scholarship, obviously here, but also in so this is a term that's becoming used more and more often. A lot of these articles have been debate about what rewilding actually means and what it ought to mean and the ethics of it. And I'll share just the tip of the iceberg of some of that debate today. Down the word rewilding itself, re kind of suggests going back to something, right? So what is it exactly that we're trying to get back to and why then? And how do we know that that was wild? Are we trying to recover woolly mammoths here, which went extinct from this continent maybe 9,000 or 10,000 years ago? Or maybe we're trying to seek a different moment in time, maybe moments before European settlers showed up here. The word rewilding has been criticized in much the same way that the national parks movement and other wilderness preservation movements have been for basically trying to make wilderness great again in a way. glorifying these moments in time where European settlers arrived and believed that they were beholding raw, untouched nature, but actually they were just oblivious to the different ways that indigenous people had been stewarding and even curating these landscapes for thousands of years already. And so rewilders, some attach themselves to a particular moment in time, a particular historic baseline. Others say we shouldn't really pay too much attention to these baselines, and instead we should be forward-looking and try to, figure out what potential we have now to create biodiversity. But all tangled up in this question is, how are people meant to be involved in rewilding and a part of rewilded or wild spaces? Another question, are we talking about releasing wolves into Yellowstone National Park here, or are we talking about like a pollinator garden in a city street? Because both of those things have been called rewilding and a whole bunch more things in between, which can get kind of confusing, right? When you're using this same word to describe a whole approaches. And the conservation biologists who take credit for coining the term rewilding have become very agitated about that definitional spread. Concern rewilding has come to mean basically too many things, and because of that is starting to mean nothing at all. So an IUCN task force composed of 33 top rewilding scholars from around the world was created to respond to this definitional chaos and create a unifying definition of rewilding. And this continuum graphic appears in a paper authored by that task force, and you can see how it kind of tries to bound the scope of rewilding and say what it is and what it isn't. And I'm going to pick on this effort a little bit during this talk, not because I think it's a waste of time to find scientific consensus, I certainly don't, but I think that some of the authors on this paper, some of the folks participating in this effort go a little bit further and are actually verging on gatekeeping rewilding. Trying to correct the record in their mind about what rewilding ought to mean for all audiences. And that's where I think they're not only maybe wasting their breath a little bit, but potentially even doing harm to the science and the movement of rewilding in keeping it closed in that way. So despite scientists' best efforts to define and clarify what they think rewilding ought to mean, the reality is that you just can't control language. An evocative and interesting word that people are going to pick up and run with and use in all kinds of myriad ways. So it's better to be prepared for that, right? And moreover, it's far from the first time that this has happened. So many times before, we've seen an environmental concept like sustainability or resilience of being either too vague or praised for being so inclusive. And time and again, social scientists and folks in the science and technology studies space will see this word boundary objects come up to explain some of that debate. So what are boundary objects? A boundary is basically an orienting point for collaborative work, and they can be real, tangible things like artifacts. They can also be concepts and ideas. One of their main defining features is something called interpretive flexibility, which is basically just that people might interpret and look at it and perceive it in very different ways from one another. So you might have a wolf, for instance, that an artist, an ecologist, and a farmer are all interested in, but they probably have very different interests in that thing. And so a boundary object is the anchor between those very different worlds, connecting the various points of interest here. And so if this debate has happened before, we might as well learn something from it, right? And that's what we try to do in this paper, is connect the discussion of boundary objects to the of rewilding and explore the reality that rewilding is a boundary object. What implications and consequences does that have for efforts to study and practice it? We supported that discussion with a qualitative discourse analysis of 4 applied rewilding projects and their web content. We were interested in how they were representing themselves and the idea of rewilding. And so just to be clear then, a discourse analysis is different from something like a program evaluation, because we weren't interested in evaluating the effectiveness or the consequences of their actual applied work. We were interested in the dialogue and the meaning making and how they were describing rewild. We were interested in questions like, how do they define rewilding? Where do these assumptions seem to come from? And who might benefit from rewilding being defined and implemented in this way? And we created a coding rubric to analyze this and chose a small sample covering a really broad range. It was a purposive sample of quite different rewilding in the world. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about these projects because you don't really need to know them well in order to follow the rest of the argument. If you follow that rewilding is a boundary object, what are the implications of that is the more important part of the paper. And I'll start by saying that I can, although I've been a little bit critical so far, I can totally empathize with scientists who are concerned about the ambiguity because it does come with some very real risks. One of the big ones is the risk of being rendered a buzzword. And so thinking back to another boundary object that I mentioned earlier, sustainability, suddenly every corporate entity has a sustainability program or commitment. And so those vary quite a lot from one another in terms of their quality. And this is basically the outcome that those rewilding purists are so afraid of, that their transformative, radical, ecological idea is going to lose its teeth because of this widespread. Moreover, ambiguity can lead to miscommunications, and that can lead to breakdowns in trust between actors, which is really important. So when people get on board with a project thinking that rewilding might mean one thing, and then later come to find that that's not actually what the project is talking about, that can erode relationships. And on the other hand, dialogue and negotiation can also a positive. So the act of actually discussing what rewilding means and why it's important can foster all as well as conflict. So all of those folks in the room on a local project, for instance, about rewilding, will have to spend time with one another, figuring out what rewilding means and what one another value. And that process can, when guided in a constructive way, help to build social capital and strengthen the work. I'm going to dial back for a second and just note, like, each of us at one point thought, I'm going to go to grad school. That's a great idea. And then we probably told our friends and family about that back home, and they were like, cool, that's awesome. And then at some point in our first year, maybe an innocent enough question came up. What's your thesis about? Terrifying, right? You start to sweat immediately. Rewilding has to go through the same thing. It's fine and well to say it's ambiguous at that broader scale, but then when the rubber actually hits the road, you have to figure out how to do this thing and what it means. So I really like the way that Layla Harris actually in our department talked about this in relation to a different boundary object, resilience, a few years ago. And she noted that difficult choices can't be avoided, basically. So when we are trying to operationalize these malleable constructs in practice, these flexible ideas, decisions have to be made, and they do get made about things like who gets to be involved, where the funding comes from, what the objectives of the work are. And all of those things are shaped implicitly and explicitly by the definition of rewilding that we choose. So for instance, if you take rewilding to mean predator reintroductions, like Rewilding Argentina from our case studies did, you're probably going to need to have a veterinarian involved in the project. And on the other hand, if you take it to mean ecotourism entrepreneurship, then maybe you'll need to have marketing staff. The scope of folks who could be affected by the work is even broader still. So if we have children who are engaged in outdoor education programs like we had here with Rewilding Vancouver, their lives stand to be affected permanently, perhaps by their participation in that program. Those are some big, heavy consequences for rewilders to grapple with, right? So how can rewilding make the most of the ambiguity while still managing some of these risks? And I like the answer offered by one of our case studies in Finland from the Snow Change Cooperative. Snow Change's rewilding work is really grounded in efforts to create Indigenous community and controlled conservation areas, ICCCAs. And so they view the work of rewilding actually as an act of social reform and of land back first. And the work of the staff at Rewilding Finland, or the Finnish landscape rewilding program, is to leverage and support the goals of community members that they're working with and community organizations they're working with, supporting with scientific and logistical support, but letting those communities decide for themselves what rewilding had ought to mean. And again, the caveat here is that we only analyzed Snow Change's web content and how they presented themselves, so I can't comment on how good and robust of a community engaged process they followed. But we noticed when we did this analysis that it was really hard to find a definition for rewilding on Snow Change's website. And in retrospect, because of the diversity of the communities they work with and the different locations they work in, we think that that was probably a deliberate choice. So thinking about cultural practice and land tenure and all of these very human topics feels in some ways like a very far cry from the self-proclaimed ecocentric approaches that rewilding has come to be associated with, and that some people are trying to enforce that definition on rewilding. To quote the IUCN, that rewilding ought to focus on removal of human control and restoring native species with minimal intervention and non-lethal means wherever possible. Looking very different from what Snow Change and the other projects are doing. But even though they're not totally sticking to the dogma, they're still achieving ecological outcomes, and in fact, still using the logic of trophic cascades and ecological function to do their work. They're just reintroducing people back into the food webs rather than charismatic megafauna. So I think Snow Change offers a really interesting example of what can be achieved when you work with the ambiguity of rewilding as a sort of putty to craft a tool that works for your local context. I've talked a lot about these issues in terms of on-the-ground applications of rewilding, which is a big focus of my work. But what about the science of rewilding? So when a boundary object gains popularity and collaborative infrastructure and conferences and departments and all these sorts of things start to pop up around it, echo chambers can form. So sometimes advocates for rewilding or any other topic, boundary object topic, can become overly focused on a boundary object and start to fail to see other viable solutions that are outside of that language and that scope. And this becomes kind of a terrible soup when mixed with the related issue that scientific communities become insular very quickly and easily. So certain standpoint theorists like Sandra Harding, for instance, would argue that true scientific objectivity actually can't be achieved without the inclusion of diverse and especially critical perspectives. So the views of folks who are critical of our work are actually the ones that will help us to address problems of validity and rigor that we can't see ourselves. The bottom line of all of this, last slide, what do I hope you'll take away from this paper, or perhaps more accurately, what do I hope that the conservation biologists we're talking to will take away from this paper? Since I think probably preaching to the choir for a couple of you folks here. But we want them to know that you can't depoliticize rewilding, in short. As a boundary object, any rewilding project will inevitably become a transaction zone for the exchange and transformation of knowledge. And so conservation biologists don't have to forget all of the great science that they bring to the table, but should recognize that it's just one of many perspectives and definitions of rewilding that they're going to have to grapple with in their work. And so we recommend kind of centering the messy dialogue and deliberation as dealing with that, what rewilding means. And the IUCN task force I mentioned earlier actually sort of tried to do this when they came up with that definition, because they engaged scientists from around the world in co-creating that definition. But where they went wrong, in my opinion, is that they only recruited their scientific field. 58 of the 62 or 64 people that they sampled were in North America or Europe, and almost all of them were conservation biologists or geographers. Only a third were women. So this is a part of the discussion, but it's not the end of the discussion, is the main point that I want to get across. And rewilding scholars and practitioners ought to be prepared to have these dialogues and these discussions about the meaning of rewilding in every context that they go and work in, over and over, with people who think differently than they do. And that's a whole skill set, right? Negotiation and dialogue and discourse is a different skill set. And so holding space for those dialogues could look like factoring that into the actual project plan, and maybe including a different set of professional skill sets on your team, such as public engagement professionals, social scientists, and community dialogue leaders. That's it. Yes. Thanks. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, totally. So I can, yeah. So the question was around like how to grapple with the ambiguity when it comes to those projects of rewilding that have multiple different sites, maybe multiple different participating organizations in different places. The one that comes to mind is Rewilding Europe, which is this broader kind of umbrella or like networked organization of rewilding projects throughout Europe. And they have a particular definition of rewilding that some of their partners in Portugal, for instance, is one of them. There's some in Spain, lots of different project sites. Some of their partners just go ahead and reproduce that definition exactly, and then figure out the methods that they want to use on the ground. Others, like Rewilding Finland, actually decline to reproduce that definition. So I would say like there's not a blanket approach maybe that organizations are using to deal with that issue. I'm also reminded of some of my past work on resilience, where I was studying the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And so the Rockefeller Foundation had a particular definition of resilience that they advocated and advanced. And it didn't work in all the places that they were trying to do resilience and build resilience. And so, yeah, I think that's where not only the theory, but like kind of the umbrella structure has to sort of be disassembled a little bit when you get to the local level and rebuilt in a way that makes more sense. But I don't know if that totally answered your question. Yes. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Totally. Okay, I'll address the first question, which was the question was around buzzwords and how like the need to think critically, I think is sort of what you're getting at, that you open a website, for instance, about rewilding, that doesn't actually say anything to you about what the work involves. So you have to dig a little bit deeper and actually figure out what these projects are all about and what they're doing. Same with sustainability, that sort of thing. Ambiguity, I think, is a blessing and a burden. We have this language of constructive ambiguity coming from political science to describe that ambiguity can serve a purpose of like getting people on board with something initially and then continuing the conversation. And that's a very contentious idea. It has not worked that well in politics. Lots of examples of that, but I think the point is that like the evocativeness, the interestingness of the word is what gets people to go to the site or maybe to the discussion in the first place. And so for me, I think that's the immediate utility of the ambiguity. And I think it's also important, maybe ethically or in terms of like justice and representation, that when you have a broader term, more people can see an opportunity to be reflected in that term. So the purpose, I guess, the potential value of continuing to use buzzwords perhaps is getting people at the table and involved in the discussion that might otherwise not have seen an opportunity for themselves to be involved and participate. So that's one aspect of that. And then the risk, like I guess my response to that would be like I wouldn't stop using the buzzwords because of all of the risks. But it's so like it's one of these things you can't like give a blanket answer either, because I'm thinking about it in the context of these like applied, conservation projects on the ground, but buzzwords are used in all kinds of different ways. I don't have expertise on things like, corporate social responsibility policies or anything like that. So I don't want to make too many like blanket statements about how it applies in those other settings. But yeah, I think the blessing and the burden of the ambiguity is that quality of bringing people together. And at the same time, you got to talk about what it means and be clear as a next step. The second part of your question, can you remind me? Mhm. How do you communicate that out? Yeah. Okay. So when you decide within your in-group basically what the meaning of this thing is, then how do you communicate that out more broadly? That's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer for that question. I think it's an interesting one to consider. And my gut reaction is, again, that it's going to be like quite different depending on the context that you're talking about. With these projects, we found in the case studies, it took some digging, basically, just as you described, to figure out what actions and measures they're actually taking, like what rewilding means to them. Sometimes is stated explicitly, but other times you have to look at the actual actions that they're taking and how they're measuring success in order to understand what they think rewilding means. So the importance of that, I think, is variable, probably to the very small local communities that Snow Change is working with and defining rewilding. Like, I don't know how much they care that the rest of the world knows what they mean by this thing. I think maybe in some cases they care that it's working for them in their immediate context. In other cases where you might have more of a advocate lens and wanting to scale up rewilding to other places, as like the IUCN I think tried to do in sharing their definition more broadly with the world. I think being clear about the process that you followed and the limitations of it is like good practice. I don't know if this is like getting at all aspects of your question, but I think so, yeah. Thanks.
I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, PhD candidate Imranul Laskar. Imranul comes from, like me, an engineering background. For him, chemical and environmental engineering. He brings that background into issues around technology, policy, and decarbonization. And today, in his dissertation, a big focus of that is, or the focus of that is decarbonizing the maritime shipping industry. But Imranul also wears multiple hats. In addition to being a PhD candidate, he also works for Environment and Climate Change Canada in their integrated transportation policy team. And so last week, he was actually in London negotiating on behalf of Canada at the International Maritime Organization. But you'll probably have to save your questions for him today on his PhD candidate hat. I don't know how much he's allowed to comment.
Oh, I was struggling with this. Can people hear me okay? Okay. Thanks, Amanda, for that really nice introduction. All right. So today I'm going to talk about one of the chapters of my thesis that really looks into or trying to understand the uncertainties in decarbonizing maritime shipping. Like international shipping as a sector is a global is the backbone of global trade and economy, and it's basically responsible for moving more than 80%, 80 to 90% of global trade by volume, and at the same time, it is also a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for more than 3% of world's greenhouse gas emissions. Which on a country level would be the 5th largest emitter. And without any stringent measures, percentage is expected to be up to 70% by 2050. So as a sector, shipping is also uniquely global in terms of its governance, so which has implications for any policymaking related to be it environment or non-environmental issues. So its governance is complex and also multipolar, as it involves international waters where sovereign nations do not have any jurisdiction. And because of these reasons, you can have a vessel which is made in Japan, but it could technically be considered to be from the Panama Islands with a Greek ownership and operated by a Chinese company, but primarily serving Canadian waters. Or Canadian maritime routes. And because of this uniqueness of this sector, shipping, like international shipping, is one of the two sectors which is not part of the Paris Agreement. And the other sector, if you can guess, it's international aviation. So, and the responsibility to govern international shipping falls on the International Maritime Organization, which is headquartered in London. And it's also one of the, it's a UN specialized agency, and it's also one of the few such agencies which has regulatory powers. And last year, the IMO, basically, they adopted like the most ambitious greenhouse gas strategy at the UN level, which aligned the international shipping with a 1.5 degrees C warming limit. So, and it includes 2050 greenhouse gas target, along with interim checkpoints in 2030 and 2040. And the strategy also included a carbon intensity target, which is around 40% reduction by 2030. And this metric is important here because, and you will see in the coming slides, because carbon intensity here is basically the amount of carbon emissions for transport work. And transport work here includes both the distance traveled by a ship and the cargo carried. And in some cases, it could also be the cargo capacity of a ship. So moving along, like now, even though the sector right now has a really ambitious strategy, the pathways to decarbonization is mired with uncertainties, both on a policy landscape and the market landscape. So like on the policy side, like currently there are no regulations that actually target absolute greenhouse gas emissions. Like currently the regulations only cover carbon intensity, and in reality we see that even with carbon intensity measures, it does not really contribute to actual greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And there are deliberations at the moment to adopt an unprecedented global carbon tax and a full greenhouse gas standard to be adopted by next year, 2025, and to be enforced by 2027. Now, it's very likely that there would be a combination of these two policy instruments to be adopted in the coming years, but the industry is still, or the shipping industry is still uncertain in how to adopt to these measures or to this regulatory regime in terms of what kind of, like what decisions to make to, in terms of the measures they could use that could help them comply with these regulations. However, there are different measures with varying levels of commercial readiness, such as operational measures, which is one of the most popular one is slow steaming, which is basically, it means reducing speed through which you reduce your fuel, meaning reduced emissions. And then you also have technological measures, which is basically like design related aspects of a vessel. And lastly, you also have alternative energy sources. So now to better understand and also characterize the uncertainties in shipping decarbonization pathways, we utilize an expert elicitation study. And we operationalize this expert elicitation work through a web-based online survey. And we also employ some of the best practices for expert elicitation, which includes minimizing cognitive biases and burden on the experts. Along with, we also list all the names of the experts along with their affiliations in the eventual published report. And the survey here is global and diverse in scope, and which also reflects the true nature of the shipping sector. And where we contacted around 438 experts, and we had a response rate of 34%. So now moving on to some of the results. So we see, so here what we're seeing is the median of experts' estimates compared to shipping CO2 emissions projections from literature. So the one in light maroon, so these are basically business as usual estimates from the IMO. And that's why you see an increasing trend, because right now there aren't any policies that actually target greenhouse gas emissions reduction or absolute greenhouse gas emission reduction. And the ones below here, they're you can see their trajectories, which are 1.5 degrees Celsius to 1.8 degrees Celsius alignment. So you could see that it goes all the way up to a net zero around 2050s. So, and in the middle, so these are our expert estimates, or the median of expert estimates in 3 scenarios, high expected and low emission scenarios. And we see that like experts predict missing the current greenhouse gas targets for all the 3 scenarios, but for different reasons. In 2030, it's mainly because even meeting the 2030 carbon intensity target do not necessarily contribute to absolute greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And in the long term, like around 2040s and 2050s, it really depends on the extent of the uptake of shipping decarbonization measures in the industry under like the rapidly evolving policy landscape and also an increasing freight demand that the sector has to meet. So yeah, and in addition to this, we also controlled experts' best estimates for their organizations, their years of work experience, their expertise, and the regional affiliations. So what we found is actually like experts who are affiliated with the nonprofit sector and who have expertise in policy and having less than 10 years of experience, they are actually the most ambitious with their estimates, especially in meeting the climate targets for the shipping sector. Now, in contrast, experts who have more than 30 years of experience are the least ambitious in their estimates. So that was interesting. So moving along to the shipping decarbonization measures. So we see that for international shipping, decarbonization is highly reliant on alternative energy in the long term, where its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions reduction doubles from 2030 to 2050 by around 60%, whereas the operational measures are more for the short term, and the technological measures basically they play a meaningful supporting role for like throughout the years, and these observations are statistically significant, and we see this across the different ship segments, which have their own distinct nature of operations, and due to such differences in operations between these different segments, we see for some segments like container shipping, the reliance on alternative energy is the highest. And say, for example, for tanker shipping, there is a potential that they could be one of the early adopters to the different alternative fuels that could be available in the future. Now, like within each of these measures, we also asked experts to rank the different options in terms of their likelihood to contribute to shipping decarbonization. And here, the plot that you see, it's only for international shipping, where we find that the likelihood of operational and technological measures increases from 2030 to 2050, which demonstrates increased maturity in the long term, despite their lower potential uptake in the long term. So which is largely owing to operational issues where it's very hard to use those measures in a ship. So, and also because they have like a lower greenhouse gas emission reduction potential compared to alternative energy options. So if you move to the alternative energy options, we see that there are really no clear winners except like the onshore power systems and the hybrid power systems. So these are the top 2 options that we found across the 2030 and 2050. And onshore power system basically is like where ports have infrastructure to electrically power ships when they're berthing. And hybrid is basically it basically means you can use different options together, like let's say LNG with wind or ammonia with hydrogen, those kind of stuff. So those two were like in the top two for 2030 and 2050. I should also flag that we also saw like fossil LNG to be in the top 5 for 2030, but in 2050 we noticed that like this is the only option where the uncertainty was the highest, where we do not necessarily see any agreement among experts, and which could be due to the fugitive emissions, methane emissions from natural gas, and also there's a lack of policy coverage, like for methane, both domestically and internationally. And also, of course, the natural gas economics and the abundance of gas in the world. Now, like in addition to like what you have seen so far, are quantitative estimates, but we also elicited from experts like qualitative open-ended responses to actually understand or to justify their estimates, like what's their underlying basis for their rankings or for their estimates. And using those responses, we characterize leverage points, meaning like interventions that would be made to transition the shipping sector towards a sustainable decarbonized pathway. And I'm not going to go through details for all of them, but these are some of the main themes that we found, like alternative energy systems, industry pessimism, spillover effects from learning from like other sectors, ship fleet turnover is a big one, and of course the supply chain part of the issue. Also, like using qualitative responses, we also characterize levers. So these are basically the mechanisms that could be used to enable those changes that I previously mentioned. So the important ones, the important themes that we found are governance, the contractual architecture, and of course, geopolitics and policy approaches. So to conclude, so this work, the expert elicitation work, it took us a year to design the entire survey. And like the results really provided a better understanding of the uncertainties in shipping decarbonization. And considering the substantial shift that's happening right now in the regulatory landscape, this work will help inform policy decision making at different governance levels, and also like provide or inform R&D opportunities in the sector. The results from this study can also be used as an input to analyze other types of assessments, like that's related to energy and environment, both within the sector and beyond. And yeah, like this expert elicitation work can also serve as an ongoing framework to reevaluate, reassess uncertainties in the future, because things are changing so rapidly. It's good to have this variation in terms of understanding whether transition has actually happened in the sector. And lastly, yeah, these are my acknowledgements. And obviously, this was a teamwork from the beginning. And I'd like to thank everyone who helped me with this research. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah, let's. Oh, yeah. So the question is, how do I, like the knowledge mobilization part of my work, how do I communicate the results of this work better, right? Obviously, we are working on publishing the results, so that's the traditional way. But we also have like Clear Seas, right, as our like we have a knowledge mobilization partner who like collaborate with us in terms of like distributing the results in different formats. Clear Seas, yeah, you can see the name in there. So they have helped us with recruitment and the like survey recruitment, deployment. So yeah, that's one of the options, definitely. And yeah, it's possibility that we can also like, I'm not sure, but I'm just thinking out loud that we can use this as an option to also present it or submit it to the IMO even. Like so, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, Kushan. Yeah, yeah. So so IMO is a group of 174 member states. Canada is one of them. Canada was one of the founding member states, and even though the regulations at the IMO are, like for example, even oil spill regulations, like one of the most recent oil spill in British Columbia was the Nathan Stewart oil spill. I don't know if anyone remembers Nathan Stewart oil spill, but so like from a Canadian perspective, the IMO makes legally binding regulations, but enforcement happens from the different countries. Like they're the ones who enforce those regulations. It's not the IMO. Right. Yeah, so the question was, what are the different types of experts we surveyed in the study? Okay, so like it was basically like we wanted to be as diverse as possible, and where like which had the full, all the different types of experts in the sector. So like in the shipping sector, you have, of course, you have the seafarers who run the ships, and then you also have policymakers, and then you have like folks who work, like who have a desk job, right? Like policymakers, consultants, NGOs, engineers, and then on the other side you also have the financing part of ship. So we had all those options, and we have responses from all the diverse sectors. So here, like, and that's where in expert elicitation it's important to identify experts, like, because if you just can't, like the expert should also have an understanding of not just shipping as a sector, but also like what it takes to decarbonize the sector. So both of those expertise are like pretty important. And one important part I didn't mention is the logistics part of it, like where like you have brokers for connecting cargo owners with the shipping companies. So yeah, but I can give more details later. Yeah. Okay. 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 I don't have to repeat it. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. So on systems, basically, so right, like when you have a ship, it goes to a port. It has to like berth to unload goods, your laptops and bags. But like when the ships do that, you have people inside, right? Like because they're part of this voyage. So the ship has to run. It has to run. So usually the ships will use auxiliary engines to run their boilers, to run their lights and things like that. So and for that, onshore power system is where the ports will provide like an electrical connection, just like a switch, where the ships can plug in and get energy or electricity from the ports. So that's basically onshore power system. And obviously, one reason is it depends how clean your electricity is. So if your electricity is coming from coal, it doesn't really matter if you're using onshore power system or the ship's auxiliary fuel, which is usually heavy fuel oil, which is one of the dirtiest fuel there is. So yeah, what's the other question? Oh, nuclear. Oh, I'm not sure. Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna say what's in the results. So, okay, so nuclear. So as you can see in the nuclear, like both for 2030 and 2050, it's basically like the lowest rank, and it did receive lowest both 2030 and 2050. But and this is for international shipping. But if you categorize into, so we also filtered the survey based on the expertise of the experts. So if They only want to respond based on certain ship segment like container or bulk carriers. Bulk carriers are basically for oranges and apples, those kind of stuff. Containers are more like fancy stuff. Okay, so for those two sectors, we saw that for nuclear, especially, around 45 to 50% of experts thought there is somewhat likely in 2050, which I thought quite interesting. It's only for those two segments. And those experts think that it depends on the social and political will, or I would say perspective towards nuclear. Because right now there are nuclear energy that is used for like research vessels and military vessels. So especially submarines. Okay, well, there's 3. I think maybe I can take yours. Yeah. So there are differences between different affiliated experts, right? Like what? Yeah. So we do like, yes, so this plot, the first one actually shows that we don't really like differentiate based on private and public, but what we do is like we show government and industry. So what we do, like one of the main like takeaway from like controlling experts based on their affiliations is that we found that like the non-profit sector are usually very ambitious with their targets. They're like usually, and the government and industry are more conservative with their targets, like whether they think that shipping as a sector can have some kind of energy transition in the near future. So yeah, but definitely non-profits, they're also like their interquartile range is also the widest, but at the same time, like their median is definitely more on the ambitious side. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.